everybody, and welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. For keen listeners of this podcast, you'll probably notice that this is a bit of a special episode. I usually release my episodes on Thursday, and this is going to be the first time that I'm releasing 2 episodes in 1 week. And the reason that is because I did something on Friday. I experienced something, I witnessed something, and I wanted to sit and record and think things out loud and express my feelings and thoughts around it while it's still, fresh in my mind and in my body. So essentially, I attended a protest here in Vienna. And it certainly wasn't my first protest. And it wasn't even my first protest here in Vienna. I've been attending protests in solidarity with Palestine for the last 3 months. But this time was a bit different, because I wasn't just another body. I wasn't just another participant in a protest whose message I agree with and that I stand in full solidarity with. This is perhaps the first time that I've attended a protest with the intention of essentially staging an intervention. I largely agree with the message of this protest, but there are so many contradictions to it that I felt I had to, alongside a lot of other people, sort of involve myself, but have our voices heard and our specific demands heard. So what was this protest? Well, so first of all, I don't know if y'all have seen, a week ago, there was this massive protest, actually several protests across Germany, protesting against the far right. Because it was revealed in some investigation that the far right, alongside the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland party, which is a far right party, which is doing scarily well in the polls, were having secret meetings. And in those meetings, they drafted up plans for what they intend to do if they gain power. And one of those plans is a mass deportation of migrants, of refugees, of immigrants. It's really scary shit. And rightfully so, people were outraged and they went down into the streets in their droves, and at first glance it was quite cool and quite good, but once you look a bit closer, there are numerous issues and problematics that become very clear, and that were very clear for me, because the protest I went to is kind of the Austrian version of that, In many ways, Austria is the younger brother of Germany. And as a younger brother myself, I'm very aware of how younger brothers can tend to want to imitate. My brother used to call me a wannabe growing up, because it's true, I did want to listen to the same music as him, and I wanted validation from him. I don't know if that's the same dynamic between Austria and Germany, but regardless, there was a similar type of protest here, which was very vaguely, against the right, against hate. And so what I'll do is I'm going to share first my experience of participating in this and participating in it in the way that I did, and then I'll follow with some of my analysis, or the contextual aspects of it all, or the political and historical Because ultimately, it's not that I learned anything new, but so many things were confirmed to me, and so many things were made very concrete, things that I've been thinking and saying for the last decade, but much more so the last 2 years since I moved to this country and found myself surrounded by white people and, in the heart, in the belly of the European imperial beast, so to say. So the first thing I'll say is that I, for some reason, have hesitated to talk at all about having participated in some of these protests. And I think that reflects one of the core differences of protests here than the protests I've participated in Lebanon, which is that every protest here is registered with the police. And I don't just mean the route or the times, but, the chants and the slogans and the banners. There is very much so this feeling that it's not so much a contestation of the street or of public space, but that we are allowed to do this thing, for this specific time with these specific things, and we are allowed by the state to air our grievances, but, obviously that comes with limitations. And people really abide by those regulations and by those registrations. And I find myself doing it too because here in Vienna, there in Austria, there really is this feeling of the state, and of the panopticon. You kind of internalize the surveillance. You always feel like the state is watching you, and you feel really scared and kind of, I don't know. So like even me talking about these things, I for some reason already feel like I shouldn't because I'm worried of exposing myself. But at the same time, I know that I haven't done anything illegal because I fit within the kind of registration laws of these protests. But again, even the fact that I'm thinking, is this legal, is this not, is already the fact that, they've kind of won. They're inside my head. But I mean, I think that's also like not just a thing of being within these really heavily surveyed and bureaucratized societies, but also it's an experience of being an immigrant, I'm not in my turf. I feel very much like I'm on their turf. Yeah, I just wanted to preface with that. So, this protest I'd heard about last week, and a lot of the groups that I've been participating in these Palestine solidarity protests were organizing to have a kind of block, to participate in this protest, but also to say, hey, where were you all in our protests? If you care about racism, if you care about the right, then why aren't you protesting with us against the Zionist genocide against our people back home and essentially the erasure of our voices and our demands and our attachments? But also essentially this thing that if you are going out on the streets as an anti-racist, then you are essentially speaking on behalf of those racialized, those marginalized communities. And so these Palestine solidarity groups are majority migrants and people of color. And so we didn't feel comfortable with letting all these other people speak on our behalf and say, oh yeah, we are anti-racist, where it's like, well, are you? So I went to this protest, and again, my first time not just being a body, but rather having a specific thing to say outside of the declared messages of the protest. So for the very first time in my life, I made a banner. And so I took the public transport, and I got a lot of looks. I was also, of course, donning my kufiyya, which has become a thing. Maybe that's a discussion for another time, but regardless. So like I was quite visible, and when I get to the tram stop and notice there's quite a lot of people, like hundreds and hundreds of people that are all walking and of a very specific, let's say, hue, very pale tones, like, I mean, that's the experience of being in Vienna, but regardless. I realized that the meeting point for this Palestine Solidarity block is on the other side. I have to pass through the whole protest. And what I find was a bit disturbing in a kind of banal way, for a protest against fascism, against the lurching far right. There was like just some lo-fi club music, down, down, whatever, and people kind of dancing a little bit, just like as though they're waiting to get into a club. And, these are white people of like all ages and whatever. And again, I emphasize that this is predominantly a white crowd. Why? Because once I cross this crowd, and I get to the other side and I meet up with the Palestine Solidarity, it's complete, people of all shades, of all races, of whatever. And it's this glaring dichotomy between the hegemonic and the counter-hegemonic, between the white majority and then not just like of a specific race or ethnicity, but this actual diversity of identities of whatever. And so there was a queer bloc, there was an anti-fascist bloc, there was all these things, but specifically here, just black and brown people of all shades and hues. And when I first got there, we were kind of marching towards the main protest, but we were stopped by the police. And they sort of formed a barricade in front of us, kind of blocking us from entering the actual space. I get super fucking triggered whenever I see any cops, and this is definitely like a Lebanon thing, or my stupid decisions, or whatever, my experiences back home. But then as we're kind of standing there and we're doing our chants and the banners are being raised, these like 3 or 4 assholes kind of stand behind us and raise, an Israeli flag. And I've been to a lot of these over the last 10 years, and, not a lot of them actually. It's super fucking triggering just seeing the flag live. And the only time I've seen it before was like 10 years ago when I lived in London and I went to some Palestine Solidarity March, and there are always these assholes. And the thing is they're trolls, they don't have any demands. They just want to trigger you and try to elicit some reaction, and then they can, cry victim, which is like the tactic of the Israeli state as well, which is crazy. But regardless, so we kind of ignore them. And we keep trying to get through to the other side. And what happens is, first of all, one white dude, like typical German, I've been discovering that there's such a thing as an anti-Deutsche, like someone, usually a white German, who's so anti-German and so self-hating that they become hardcore Zionists as a way of relieving that whatever, and end up being incredibly racist and white supremacist, essentially. He walked through our crowd and was yelling, "Free Gaza from Hamas, free Gaza from Hamas." And this is like one of their new things. They love this chant. They think it's genius, and it's disgusting. But we're all really trying to keep our cool. We're chanting our things. We're focused. We're not letting ourselves get distracted by these guys. But what ends up happening is that once we get a bit closer, these Zionist assholes sort of run in front of us and basically create a corridor between us and the main protest. And then the cops kind of reinforce and create these boundaries between us. So if you come just at that moment, it looks like, well, 2 sides, And it looks like, oh, these, loud brown barbarians, and like want to come in. But it's actually really disturbing when you think about it, because this is exactly, again, the Israeli line. Because what did the president of Israel say the other day? That Israel is a bulwark. It is a barrier that prevents the Arab barbarian from coming to Europe. And that's what the slur looked like and what they wanted to set up, which is essentially that there's this thin line of Israelis, of Zionists, that are stopping this horde of angry brown people from entering the main thing. So I don't know, and I don't know what to do in these situations. And we kind of stood there, and there were organizers talking to the cops and cops talking to the whatever. Bit of background as well, actually. There was actually some discussions of allowing Palestine Solidarity, like, in the main protest, and even, like, to be one of the speakers. But there was literal, like, erasure and exclusion. And so I honestly started to get really nervous at this point, because there was a vibe. There's this guy who I know who's like an older librarian. He's American, he's Jewish. And he was holding a banner that said Zionism is fascism, right? And he was like nervous as fuck. And he got really harassed and really yelled at. And I saw him like break down crying because it was just too much, He was yelling, and it's really difficult to be taking these stances, And there's also like a lot of like random people running left and right, and the cops were making maneuvers, and there's this really scary feeling, something is happening. And I felt this before, and I started to take a step back, and these situations really push me to my boundaries, and I really start to consider, like, what am I capable of doing? Because my instinct is to run away, but at the same time I feel like I need to take a stand, and I need to whatever, but at the same time I don't feel like the most secure person in this country, and I don't know, and mentally and whatever, but that's a whole other discussion. But I started to feel it in my legs, like shaking and really nervous. And that lasted for about 10 minutes before some of the organizers started coming up to us. And I was with a friend who I sort of designated as my support person or whatever. And these 2 organizers, I think from Fridays for Future, came up to us and were asking, "Are you guys okay?" and whatever. And it was ridiculous because one of the people I was with started saying, well, if you care about our security and our safety, then A, why are the cops facing us? If they're supposed to be protecting us, why are they facing us? And then second of all, if it's meant to be you want to make us safe and whatever, why are you allowing these people to carry this flag, which represents a state which is enacting a genocide right now, which is just literally a hate symbol at this point? And, it's not, oh, we want all voices, we want Arabs and racists and imperialists all in the same room talking. Like, that's not diversity, that's not equality, that's not a safe space. And she literally said something which was so revealing. She said, oh, well, some organizers wouldn't even allow, you to participate, but we're allowing you to be here. And there was this hubris, this who the fuck do you think you are, to say you allow us to participate and to be here. Like, this is our right. And it was just another one of those examples where it's like white people cannot just sit down and listen to what we're saying. And they genuinely think that they know what to do. And they know how to fix these things and how to create these spaces and how to heal the wounds that in most cases they themselves and their states and their armies have created. Okay, I'm getting a bit worked up. I'm gonna scale it back. So at a certain point, there were some discussions and the police opened up and allowed us to, there was some discussion that we're allowed to enter the main thing, but we're not allowed to hold our banners or chant. And I think everyone knew what that meant, which was they allowed us in and we just kept chanting anyway. At one point, we hear someone take to the stage and yell something about how shameful it is that at an anti-racist protest, there is a clear section where mostly black and brown people are being kettled and kept in the corner. And it's shameful and it's contradictory and it's hypocritical. And honestly, I never really got a sense of the space because we were kept outside of it. Once we were able to go in and I could get a better view, I could see that there was quite a lot of people. But there was very much so a division between the main protest and us. And again, us who are chanting for Palestine, for an end to genocide, for an end to colonialism, who are saying that Zionism is a form of racism and that you cannot be an anti-racist and a Zionist. It is just a contradiction of terms. But also what we're pointing out, and here I start to get into the actual analysis, is that in our sheer presence and our insistence of being present and their insistence of excluding us, they betray the very structural racism that exists and permeates the society right now. Not because of the far right, not because of something that's going to happen, but what exists right now. And I can think of so many examples and so many ways of illustrating this point. Austria is one of the few European countries, one of two, that voted against a ceasefire at the UN. There was a poll that was released only a few months ago about racism in Europe, and it was a huge long-term study of black people in Europe. And they found that not only is racism rampant in Europe, but the two worst countries for black people in terms of experience and daily exposure to racism is Germany and Austria. And, you have the German chancellor who is a staunch Zionist and talking about deportation, and the ways that they're talking about brown people in Germany is just horrendous and it's racist. And white people don't seem to see that as a problematic. I saw a picture today actually that I think summed up so much of my thinking. I wish there was a way of sharing it, but essentially it was it's a little cartoon with two pictures, and one, there's I think it's a wolf living in a house with a broken roof, and there's rain, and the wolf is inside. And the second picture is it's sunny, and the wolf is poking his head outside of the roof. And it reads, Haggis has a hole in his roof. He never fixed it because on rainy days it was too wet to work, and on sunny days it doesn't need fixing. And I think this so perfectly sums up why fascism is on the rise and why it's super terrifying to see white liberal people thinking that they have things under control when they just don't. My experience yesterday was going to this protest and thinking, you people are unserious. Like, you are not actually prepared to fight fascism, to resist fascism. It's not going to be a party. And you only showing up now, there aren't protests that often here. And if there are, aside from like the Palestine protests, it's like weird right-wing nut jobs who are protesting and organizing around like COVID conspiracy bullshit or whatever. And so there's just this real feeling at this protest where it's like, we've done our part. We went to this thing, and I don't think they're going to continue organizing, but they're definitely going to feel good about themselves that they've actually done something when they haven't. And actually resisting fascism takes organizing, it takes commitment, it's laborious, it's scary, it's risky, but and I do believe everybody, you can do it, but the contradictions that are so apparent at this protest, wherein there's a harsh divide of white people who are kind of talking to themselves. Oh, I should mention, there was some dickhead that was on stage that like kind of noticed the flags and said, go home, you kids, that has nothing to do with what we're dealing with. And it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. The hubris that they know fascism better than us, that they know racism better than us. And they not only know how to see it, but they know what to do about it. And so, honestly, this experience yesterday was such a vivid elaboration and expression of my fears and worries that there are no adults in the room, that basically there is this lurch to the right, and the center has moved to the right, but also that the right wing are just organizing and are serious and are taking power, and the masses of people are doing nothing, and they're complacent and they're fine. And again, I'm talking specifically about white people, because within this privilege, within this power structure of white supremacy, white people are kind of fine for now, but that bubble is getting smaller and smaller. And if they don't listen to black and brown people, fascism is going to come through the door or through the window. And there's not a goddamn thing they can do about it, because they've already thrown anybody who can like stop it or like see it or knows the forms that it's taking completely under the bus. And it's this kind of thing of, first they came for the X and then I did nothing because I'm not X. And so I think if white people are really serious about tackling fascism, they need to start listening to black and brown people, to racialized people. They need to understand their positionality within white supremacy that makes it such that there's stuff they don't see. There's stuff about themselves they don't see. There's stuff in the society that they don't see, that they don't think is a problem, that if they actually were to listen to an immigrant or to a refugee, that would be much more clear. Because people upstream, downstream, smell the shit much quicker. I like this metaphor. And we smell the shit much sooner before it hits them. But once it hits them, it's already too late. And that's something that I was really afraid of with this protest, where it's like, them coming out now, I'm not a cynic. I'm not saying it's too late. But it is late. Late for them to be seeing this thing, which people like me, like other Arabs, like Muslims, have been saying for decades. Well, for me, for a decade, but regardless. So I hope I made the points that I wanted to make. There's just so much to think about and to talk about, but that protest really exemplified so many of the things that I've been thinking and talking about in terms of white supremacy, not of the fringe, but of the majority, of just most white people, of the white supremacy that they're born into, that of the world we live in. It's something that permeates our economies and the world and the ecology and everything. And so being born a white person in this white supremacist world that white people ultimately have created, or at least their ancestors and whatever. And so to recognize that and to know what the tools are to dismantle that, you have to listen to black and brown people. And if you don't, then you are essentially replicating the exact same thing that you claim to want to be destroying and dismantling, which is white supremacy. So I hope I made some coherent points there. I really wanted to share this experience because, yeah, it was a lot, and I'm definitely going to be thinking about it. And again, it confirmed so much, and I don't know what to do from here on in. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Politically Depressed. As always, if you like this podcast, please leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening to your podcasts. And if you really like this podcast, you can support it through monthly donations at patreon.com/firethesetimes. The Fire These Times is a media ecosystem project from and for the periphery, which supports this podcast and many others. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you all next time.